on this day, the 5th of January, 1066, the death of Edward the Confessor. Edward had been King of England since 1042. He succeeded Harthacnut, ending the Danish Viking rule in England. Edward was the seventh son of Ethelred the Unready, who had lost the throne to Sweyn Forkbeard for a year. Edward's half-brother Edmund Ironside had succeeded his father for just 7 months, before the Danish Canute had seized the throne. Canute's son Harthacnut invited Edward to return from his exile in 1041, probably intending to recognise him as heir to the throne, as Harthacnut grew ill and had no son to succeed him. Initially popular, Edward hit a crisis in 1051 when the powerful Earl Godwin of Wessex was accused of plotting to murder the king. Godwin and his family fled into exile, but returned a few years later. A spate of deaths had left them in an even more powerful position, as they added the earldom of Northumbria to their portfolio. Many see this return as a critical moment in Edward's rule, as royal authority was sapped away by powerful nobles, never a good situation for a kingdom. Edward died on the 5th of January 1066, in his early 60s, after what may have been a series of strokes. He was beatified a century later, given the name Confessor, as a saint who had not suffered martyrdom. Remembered as somehow above the grubby real world, his death nevertheless sparked perhaps the most famous and seismic succession crisis in English history. With no son, and having failed to make a clear settlement, when Edward was buried at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of January, Harold, son of Earl Godwin, was crowned the same day. This would lead to a dispute with Duke William of Normandy, who had pressed his own claim, along with an accusation that Harold had promised to cede the crown to William if he was ever offered it. Before the end of 1066, Harold would see off another Viking invasion, but would be defeated at Hastings by Duke William's Norman invasion, loudly ushering in a drastic change in England. One of Edward's enduring achievements was the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, which was dedicated on the 29th of December 1065, though Edward himself was too unwell to attend. When Henry III rebuilt the abbey again in the 13th century to create the beginnings of the building we see today, he did so in part because of his obsession with Edward the Confessor. Henry named his first son after the Saint King, and he would become King Edward I. Henry had Edward the Confessor's remains moved to sit at the centre of the chapel near the sanctuary in pride of place in his new abbey, and Henry then had himself buried on the spot where Edward's remains had been moved from. A very proper figure of a man, of outstanding height and distinguished by his milky white hair and beard, full face and rosy cheeks, thin white hands and long translucent fingers. In all the rest of his body he was an unblemished royal person, pleasant but always dignified. He walked with eyes downcast, most graciously affable to one and all. If some cause aroused his temper, he seemed as terrible as a lion, but he never revealed his anger by railing.